All right. Welcome everyone to today's Kubernetes Office Hours West Coast Edition, where we answer your user questions live on the air with our esteemed panel of experts. You can find us in #OfficeHours on Slack. Check the topic for the URL for the event information, and also we have a discuss thread that we will link to shortly. Before we begin, let's start by introducing ourselves. I'm your host, Jeffrey Sika, and then let's talk to our panel. First up, Bob, here on the right on my screen.
That works. My name is Bob Killen. I'm a research cloud administrator for the University of Michigan, and I work with Jeff. We tend to share an office, but today we're both at home. My sort of specialty is on-prem deployments, things with federation, interesting networking setups, and everything in between.
All right. Ralph, you're next to Bob on my screen, so you're next.
Hi, my name is Ralph Bankston. I'm currently a customer reliability engineer at VMware, formerly Heptio, and my specialty is networking and cluster troubleshooting, and then deployment patterns, both cloud and on-prem.
Awesome. Josh, you're up next.
Hi, Josh Burkus. I work for Red Hat. And I can answer questions about running databases on Kubernetes, which is my hobby. Some stuff about storage. And also anything that you wanted to know about the Kubernetes release process.
Awesome. And Rada, last but not least.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo. I'm working at Kinfolk Kubernetes full-time. Right now I'm working on creating a distribution based on Flatcar that is a drop-in replacement for CoreOS.
Awesome, awesome. So before we start, here are some ground rules. This is a judgment-free zone. Everyone had to start from somewhere, so please help out your buddy by having a supportive environment in the channel and on stream. While we do our best to answer your questions, we, the panel, don't have access to your cluster, so live debugging is kind of off topic. But we'll do our best to get you moving down the next step and in the right direction. Panelists, you are encouraged to expand on your answers with your experiences and pro tips. You are on the panel. Audience, you can help us by pasting in URLs to official docs and blogs or anything that might be relevant to the topic at hand. Our Slack invite page is down, so if you're unable to use Slack, please post your questions on the Discuss site. I will tweet out the link as well just to make sure there's additional exposure. You can help us out by tweeting and spreading the word and paying it forward. Each session is recorded and available on YouTube. If you're using this as a work resource, please let us know how we're doing so we can try and make it better. We're always looking for marketing help, so if you're awesome at social media, please help us, because a bunch of us aren't. And we'll be holding a raffle for the audience at the end. We like to give away a t-shirt every session, and we're looking to do more, so it pays to come back and stick around. Lastly, feel free afterwards to hang out in #OfficeHours. Other channels tend to be a little busy, and if you're looking for a nice, friendly home, you're more than welcome to chill. With that, let's start with the questions. Bob, have you put the questions in the document? Because I don't think...
Scroll down.
Yep. All right. So we want to prioritize all the questions that are in office hours. However, we realize that a lot of times questions don't just happen in office hours, so we tend to scour Kubernetes novice and Kubernetes users for questions in the meantime. So first off, we have a question from Mac in Kubernetes novice. Hi, what happens if I do a rolling update and one of the users using the app is on the old pod and hits submit and the new pod comes up? How is that submit handled correctly during the rolling update?
And you're probably the best person to answer this one. I can answer, but...
So, okay. Does anyone else want to answer?
Go for it.
All right. There's no real way to control that, so it depends on your deployment, but generally if your pod goes down and then the new one comes up, the submission is going to hit the new pod. So if there are things like database migrations that happen as part of the rolling update, you have to make sure that those all complete before the new pod comes up and the old pod goes down. Oftentimes you actually want to have it set up so the new pod comes up before the old pod goes down, so that traffic transitions seamlessly. But the short answer to your question would be, in general, based on that question, traffic would just get routed to the new pod, so hopefully that new pod can keep state from the old pod. Sorry, that might have been overcomplicated.
And you can also have like the middle tier sort of layer to keep track of some of that stuff.
Yeah, like a caching layer or a like
something to just keep the session persistent stuff.
Yeah. Any other opinions, panel? All right. Next up, we have Hangover Nero from Kubernetes Novice. Is it possible to add a default access mode to a volume claim?
To a volume.
Which one is going to go first?
Okay. I don't believe so. Usually you will define a set of volume claims in your PVC or your storage class, or not your PVC, in your PV or your storage class, and then your PVC is just going to be the thing that consumes one of those things out of that. If you want all of them to sort of have a specific one, I know it's possible to create like multiple storage classes backed by the same storage, at least like storage appliance or something like that, with those sort of different settings in place.
Any other comments? Otherwise, I think we will move on. So next up, we have Thunderhill 4 from Kubernetes users asked, can a service with cluster IP be exposed through ingress? Is it mandatory to have a node port?
I'll take this one. Yes, I think, well, the ingress needs to be exposed, but the service behind ingress can have a cluster IP and it should just work. I think I tried it like last week even.
Yep, that's how it works as far as I know.
I was also going to add that it depends on the CNI in use. Certain ones, cluster IP is still exposed externally, even without ingress, so it doesn't make a difference. So the ones that I'm thinking of are the AWS VPC CNI. You can route across VPCs natively with that CNI. And then also, if you're using kuberouter as in place of kubeproxy, some other items get changed around differently.
All right. I think that answers that. Next up, we have 131 from Kubernetes users. They ask, does anyone have any experience setting up Prometheus Federation? I know I personally don't have experience setting up Prometheus Federation, but I know one of the open source projects that makes it fairly easy, which is Thanos.
I've been setting that up the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Honestly, it works pretty well. It's like if you're using the Prometheus operator, it's just a little like sidecar that you can enable with it. And then it will sort of save everything else into some like object storage. That way, like you can have your actual Prometheus instances themselves don't have to have much in the way of disk space available, and everything's stored in object storage and however you want to have like that sort of move from I don't know if you want to move it off to like Glacier, but you can move through different storage tiers and things like that. The one thing I will say is that you do have to expose the store API externally on all the instances for them to be able to communicate with each other if you want to get like up-to-date information. You can get the information that's stored in the bucket, but that will be delayed a bit.
All right. Anyone else have any other experience with Prometheus clustering? All right. Next up, from Kubernetes users, we have Satish Mahan. They ask, any recommendations for service discovery across multiple clusters?
I don't have a recommendation like from my personal experience, but a few days ago, Cilium 1.4 was released. It has multi-cluster service routing. I never use it. Just read about it, so it might be something worth looking at.
Any other thoughts, panel?
I know if you're using Federation, there's the multi-cluster like DNS service thing. Give me a second, I can grab a link.
While you are grabbing a link, I just want to yet again tell everyone that happens to be listening, we are open to answer any questions. If you can hop into the office hours Slack if you have already joined the Kubernetes Slack, or if you can hop onto discuss.kubernetes.io, there is an office hours thread that we will be happy to answer your questions. And Bob did plop that link in. Awesome. So next up, Alt tab. We have Kiv from Kubernetes users. How can I create a custom firewall rule for a GKE cluster to connect to a compute engine other than giving the pod IP range? Thoughts?
I'm not super familiar with GKE. I don't know about anyone else here.
I'm also not really familiar with GKE or GCP, to be honest.
Yeah, me neither, but I guess there should be some like security group thing that you can use for connections between the nodes, like between an external compute engine machine and a compute engine that is running on GKE. But it's a wild guess. I really don't know.
That's fine. We can table that one and try and look that one up later and give them an answer. In the office hours Slack, David just asked, I've got another question about ingress. If I create a wildcard DNS entry and point it at the API server, does ingress traffic flow into the cluster via HTTP, HTTPS on the API server? Or do we need to open additional ports on the nodes themselves? Are there any docs that happen to make this clear? Thanks.
Where is the question written?
This one is in office hours, the office hours Slack. I'm going to post it in the HackMD right now.
I just did.
Thank you. If you have any questions for David, he seems to be active in Slack right now, so you can always ask clarifying questions. Does anyone have any thoughts immediately?
Are you putting it like when you say the API server, are you putting it at the Kubernetes API server?
Yeah, if it's the API server, it won't work. You need traffic to go to the nodes running the ingress controller. So basically, you can use things, it depends, but like metal LB, or just use the node IP and node port of the ingress controller, or make the ingress controller use the host network, so it uses like port 80 or 443. But yeah, it's an issue on itself how to route traffic to the ingress. Yeah, if you are using a cloud provider, you probably want to use a load balancer just for that.
Yeah. In general, I would avoid sort of sharing the master services or the control plane services with things that you're hosting in there, unless you absolutely have to. Generally, you want your ingress or other services that you're spinning up that's actually consuming it to consume like a different IP or different means of entering the system.
Yeah, and that's a tricky thing because nodes IP address might vary unless you have something. So if you're on a cloud provider, usually use a load balancer. And if you are on bare metal, check metal LB or something like that. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, big +1 for metal LB.
+1 for me as well. Seems like we answered David's question. If there are any other questions, please toss them in office hours or in that discuss thread. Otherwise, we will be moving on to another question from Kubernetes users. Jan asks, "Hi, I upgraded from 1.11 to 1.12.5 as per the documentation, but now HPA seems broken. Kube controller manager logs say, warning, reason, failed get resource metric, unable to get metrics for resource CPU, unable to fetch metrics from resource metrics API. The server could not find the requested resource, get pods, metrics, cates.io.
Sounds like one of the changes that they've been making to metrics in order to standardize all of them. I don't remember one in particular that blocked HPA, though. Let me look.
I know that Heapster was deprecated in 1.11.
Oh, was that a Heapster warning?
Well, it doesn't Heapster serve up the... Well, Jeff, you know this more.
It didn't look like a Heapster warning. Heapster was deprecated, but it wasn't removed. Heapster wasn't fully removed until 1.13. That's the point at which Heapster is like not available. You have to install it like manually. But till then, Heapster was the default, and I think metric server was recommended or optional.
Did they enable on 1.12? Did they enable the metrics custom resource API flag? Because there's some flags to enable on I believe it's the API server for some of those extensions to work.
That I don't know, and I also don't know if in the release notes that's part of it. If the release notes actually state that this is a new flag that they need to enable once they upgrade from 1.11. That would be something to look into. But I definitely think it is some wonkiness with Heapster and metric server and the migration path from Heapster to metric server that's causing that. At that point, we'd need a little more information on their cluster, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense, but it rings a bell. Kubernetes used to have the cAdvisor port enabled by default. I don't know if Heapster was using that or not, but maybe that changed independently of Heapster, and that is what is broken.
That would definitely be another thing to check. All right, moving on. From Kubernetes users, Kiddomon asks, hey, we are trying to decide between using config maps versus embedded in deployment spec. Thoughts? Are config maps the recommended way to do configs in Kubernetes? panel.
I'm not sure what is embedded in the deployment spec.
Oh, good. It's not just me. I don't know what this alternative is she's talking about.
I think they mean building it into the container itself.
Really? Okay, well, I would use config maps over that any day. Because otherwise you're redeploying a container image because you really want to set something to 5 seconds instead of 4 seconds.
Yeah, you can template out most of a config and then add config map options to pull in what needs to be done, kind of a per Kubernetes cluster sort of deployment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're talking about putting it in the images, et cetera, for deployment, then, I mean, realistically, when I do something, I'm honestly doing kind of a mix. Because it obviously comes up a lot with database containers because databases have 8 million configuration variables. There's like 90% of the database configuration that I know I'm never going to want to change in a Kubernetes runtime because I'm not going to be using obscure storage hardware and I'm not going to be changing, the transaction isolation, and I'm not going to be getting whole tons of things. But there's a handful of stuff that I will potentially change at deployment time, or even after deployment time, and I put all those in a config map. As a matter of fact, some of the databases on Kubernetes, the tooling is specifically designed, and some of the operators are specifically designed to pull config maps in order to push down configuration changes to the individual pods. And that's obviously not going to work with an image build approach.
I would point out that config maps can be used as be mounted as files and also can be used through environment variables. So it's quite flexible, and yeah, I think they are good.
Also in the office hour Slack, Omicronian said this falls maybe into self-templating where on launch a pod authenticates itself and then has a config template once running, and a init container reaches out to a tool like Password Vault or other tool to template for configs. That's probably best practice, but most people use config maps directly. But yeah, configs and containers are usually bad.
Definitely back up for like secrets and things like that.
Yes, I would agree. Again, for those that are joining us, if you have any questions for our panel, please ask in the Kubernetes Slack or in the Kubernetes Discuss instance. There should be an office hours thread that you can ask questions in, and we're monitoring. Let's go back to our list of questions. From Kubernetes users, R. Vandegrift asks, I have an app using an empty dir volume for scratch space. Is there a way to prevent kubectl drain from stopping if it finds that volume? Ideally, I'd be able to mark it as disposable so kubectl drain could still warn operators about other pods with local storage.
Sorry, I actually have not explored the interaction of kubectl drain with ephemeral volumes.
Yeah, I think there's a flag on. I'm pretty sure there's a flag on there to, like, if it has an empty dir or something like that, when you drain it, to just like go ahead and delete everything there.
Yeah, there's a flag that is like delete local storage or something like that. But I think the question is asking like if this can be marked as disposable, so residual drain could still warn operators about other pods with local storage. So, like, this flag is not enough. Like, if I understand correctly, he just wants to know if other pods with local storage are there, but not the non-important ones. Do I understand correctly?
Let me reread it.
I'll reread it for the stream as well. I have an app using an empty dir volume for scratch space. Is there a way to prevent kubectl drain from stopping if it finds that volume? Ideally, I'd be able to mark it as disposable so kubectl drain could still warn operators about other pods with local storage.
Yeah, so now I want to actually set this up and try it out. I wasn't even aware that kubectl drain had a problem with empty dirs. So
yeah, me either.
Yeah, I think it's just a flag.
Well,
yeah, it's an all or nothing flag.
There's a general force flag, but there's not anything specific.
No, yeah, there is a delete local storage flag for kubectl drain. Or it was like that, or something like that. I can check.
Yep. I found. I'll paste it right in the office hours Slack here. So,
so I guess there's no way to mark an empty dir as disposable, so kubectl drain doesn't warn about that empty dir, but warns about other pods with local storage.
Yeah.
As far as you know.
So they want one in particular to be disposable, but not the others, if there are any.
Right.
Yeah.
My general perspective is if it's not disposable, you shouldn't be using empty dir in the first place. But
I'm curious if I do that if you map it to tempfs.
Well, then it depends on why you're draining the node, right?
Yeah.
Drain doesn't shut down the node. You do that through some administrative thing. But yes, if it's mapped to tempfs, then if you're restarting the physical node, then you're going to lose the data anyway. So I think the answer for the asker, though, is no, there currently is no way to do that. If they have a good, is this somebody, if they have a good use case for it, then the answer would be to go to SIG storage, this would involve both SIG storage and SIG CLI, but to go to is the kubectl repo called kubectl or is it called CLI? I think it's called CLI.
I think it's called CLI as well.
Yeah. File an issue and make a use case as to why you should have such a feature, why such a feature should exist, what the use case is.
It is not CLI.
It is kubectl.
What is kubectl? Okay.
Issue tracker and mirror of kubectl code.
Yeah, sorry, we just moved all that stuff recently, and I didn't remember where it was.
Yeah. There's the CLI runtime, this repo.
Yeah, but
Omicronian says client Go maybe. I would want to just mention client Go is actually just the client libraries in Go. That's not actually where kubectl or any of the CLI things live. They actually are in a separate repo. Client Go is just for like building a Go application on top of Kubernetes or using Kubernetes libraries. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, if they were to file an issue for this, they would file it in Kubernetes/kubectl.
Yeah.
Because that's why that repo exists, so that people can file issues like this.
Yep.
And they would need to make a use case for it, and be aware that the first response they're going to get is, if the data is not disposable, why are you using empty dir?
That was my thought.
I mean, what's the current graduation status of local persistent volumes?
Are they in alpha still?
No, I thought it's beta.
Is it beta?
Yeah. I mean, that's the reason why local persistent volumes are a feature, so that people can differentiate. Because likely when we get local persistent volumes, somebody else is going to file a PR to say that kubectl drain should just automatically delete any empty dir without asking.
Yeah.
They went beta.
That's the behavior I would personally want. So, yeah.
They went beta in 110, Bob?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm out of date.
Well, yeah, but they're not graduated yet.
Yeah, they're not graduated.
I don't see any good reason other than round to it's why they're not GA at this. Round to it's and probably conformance testing are probably the only reasons why local PVs are not GA yet. So once local PVs are GA, or if you're willing to use them as a beta feature, the answer is, well, how will kube control drain?
Aren't most beta features turned on by default too?
Depends on the beta feature.
Okay.
Core DNS wasn't turned on by
some
default.
aren't.
I said Core DNS wasn't turned on by default when it went beta.
Unless, right. But other things have been. It actually honestly really depends on the feature.
Yeah, I think Core DNS wasn't turned on by default because we were still there was still a DNS like service. We had kubedns.
Yeah. Anyway, so is this on kube control users?
No, this was in Kubernetes users, not kube control users. If that's what you meant.
Kubernetes users, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I should follow up on this because if this user has a specific use case, like I could make a pretty good argument for once local PVs are GA, that the behavior of kube controlled drain should be to automatically delete empty dirs and to require a force to delete local PVs.
Completely agree.
Yeah. Because that would be the way you differentiate them, right? And then for their use case, they put the important data in a local PV and they put the disposable data in an empty dir, and they get the behavior they want.
Yeah. The other thing too is like local PVs do actually play into scheduling. So if something does start up again and is consuming a local PV, it will do its best to place it on the same node where that local PV was initially provisioned.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. That was fun. Next up from Kubernetes users, we have Timon V. I'm polishing up our CI/CD pipeline and ran across Jenkins X, which looks pretty amazing. Does anyone have experience with it? Head shakes, head shakes.
Just normal Jenkins.
Yep. So I don't have personal experience with Jenkins X either, but just for the viewers, I will say Jenkins is, a very extensible Java-based CI/CD system, job system, build system. Jenkins X is a flavor of Jenkins that is tooled specifically for Kubernetes. So it's all about doing Jenkins on Kubernetes and being Kubernetes native. Unfortunately, none of us have much experience with it. What I will ask is, if you can, panel, what CI/CD system are you using with Kubernetes? I will go first since I'm the one asking the random question. At work, Bob and I are using GitLab and GitLab integration with Kubernetes to manage a lot of our stuff.
Note that we are not using their automated DevOps thing or whatever it is.
Yeah, we're not using auto DevOps. We just have GitLab CI integrating with Kubernetes through our own little glue.
On my previous job, I was using an open source tool from Zendesk that is called Samsung. That is a little more than that, but we were using GitHub that ran tests on Travis on every pull request. And and when it was merged, it had a hook for our Samsung thing that build a Docker image and deploy it and told you via Slack if it worked or not. This is not a very well-known tool, Samsung, but it was really good for me.
Any other things? Ralph, I see you unmuted.
We use Jenkins, straight flavored Jenkins, and use special just scripts to go to places.
I don't know if you can answer this, but what's the most common one you see out in the wild?
Jenkins.
It's sort of been the go-to for many, many, many years.
Mm-hmm. I work for Red Hat, so we use some of everything. I mean, we obviously have a lot of Jenkins around. We're also using Knative pipelines, which is new. We have our own S2I, which is part of OpenShift. And that gets used both for OpenShift stuff, and it gets broken out and it gets broken out. I'm trying to remember the name of it when it's not part of OpenShift, and used as part of the Fedora infrastructure. And we have a couple of other things kicking around as well for different purposes, including Ansible container, and one that we created specifically for the atomic RPM OS tree images that I don't remember the name of right now.
I want to hear more about that later. With that, let's move on. Next up from Kubernetes users, we have A. Stasiak. Is there any way to abort image pull and force retry when it takes too long when deploying? My immediate thought is you would just delete the pod and have it restart, like the pod lifecycle. I see 2 nods. 3 nods, 4 nods. All right, that's consensus. So you would delete the pod if it's hung like that, and that would trigger whatever higher level object to create a new pod and then start the pod lifecycle again.
We all need the like +1 stickers or something like that whenever we're backing something up.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Oh, there you go. Perfect. All right, then. Go for it.
Yeah, the pod might also change the node it's scheduled on. So it might be good if there's a problem with that node or something.
All right. Next up from Kubernetes Novice, we have Jason. Hey all, I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around why pods share Linux namespaces. If you have a set of processes you want to share namespaces, why not just put them in the same container instead of in the same pod? The way the namespace interaction is the same for containers, whether they're running in Kubernetes or outside in a regular Docker setup. I kind of want to reread that again because that sounded a little odd.
I think it's that they're asking why you put 2 containers instead of just making a big fat pod. And why you put 2 container images inside of a pod instead of just one big giant container.
Yeah, the question is, why do we have pods in the first place?
And let's see, Amakranian's adding stuff in Slack too. Yeah, they don't share process namespaces by default. Shared process namespace is a newer feature coming online mostly from like the perspective of debug containers.
Yeah, but they do share a cgroups namespace.
The network namespace, at least.
Yeah.
Do they share any other namespaces? I don't think they share proc. Yeah, no, they don't share proc yet. I think it's just network. We're typing.
Oh. I need in some kind of a macro that automatically kills my mic whenever I start typing.
I have the feeling that there was some other namespace also shared, but don't really remember. In any case, yeah, I also think the question is how Jeff was saying, why do we have pods in the first place?
I mean, I'm happy to do this. I just assume just about anybody in the project could answer this question, which is that your unit of build work, your unit of microservice work is not necessarily the same thing as your unit of application work, particularly when you look at reusable components. To give you an example, a simple example, because how I got into Kubernetes was deploying databases in Kubernetes. So, for example, one of the things that's frequently used with Postgres is a connection pooler called PG Bouncer. And depending on how I'm setting up my connection environment, sometimes I want one pooler per backend node for Postgres. And in that case, it actually simplifies my deployment a lot and improves network performance if I have those two sharing a network namespace in a pod. But I don't want to put them both together in the same container because it's two separate binaries, it's two separate executables. They have their own individual configuration files, and they have their own separate release schedules in the upstream. So all of the stuff that goes into build and configure for those two applications is going to be separate. It's just that I want to deploy them together. And that's the reason that pods and their shared network namespace exist.
Yeah, one other example, I think from the docs is you have a service that exposes via an HTTP server a file from a Git repository, and it's updated every time the Git repository changes. And you can have all in one container, but using the both abstraction, you can have just a web server, another container that just knows how to pull from the Git repository, and a shared volume. And that's an important thing that's also shared between pods, between containers in a pod. So you have these reusable containers. A static web server is quite reusable. And you might also change if it's a Git repository or how it pulls without changing anything else, or maybe even reuse that Git puller thing to another project. So with this pod abstraction, you have the logical unit of deployment group, but not necessarily masked in one container. Of course, you can just use one container. Your mileage may vary.
I think that has been answered. Next up, from Kubernetes users, we have Alex. Does anyone have any familiarity with standing up a bare metal cluster in a corporate network where there's a root CA of the organization that's trusted? I would like the Kubernetes CA to be a subordinate CA off from the corporate CA, but while the corp CA is trusted on the Linux node, the API server cert is signed by the subordinate CA. Normally, you can add a second cert of the subordinate CA to the HTTPS services certificate so the chain is traceable back to the known corp CA. However, that doesn't seem to work adding a second certificate block into the Kubernetes PKI API server cert. This is going into the realm of SSL certs and there be dragons. I'm not touching this one. Someone else please go.
Well, I hate to I hate to call out Ralph, how have you seen people do this in the enterprise?
No, usually they just have their standard cert that they use, and they don't. I have not seen a lot of folks use the second cert setup in there.
I have not tried this myself, so I honestly can't really comment on it.
I'm actually curious if this is a common practice in enterprise or if they're just spinning up their own, like a separate SSL cert. And Ralph, you said that most of what you've seen, they're creating a completely different cert chain for it, right?
Yeah.
Does anyone know like what benefits they get from having the Kubernetes certs in their own cert chain as opposed to just creating a new one? Huh. Yeah. All right. That one I think is going to be a tough one to answer, especially without a bit more context as to why they're trying to do that.
My best guess is some crazy corporate policy.
Gotcha. All right, then we'll move on. From Kubernetes users, I am not going to be able to pronounce this name. Zufar asks, Hi all, I just want to ask a basic question. I deploy a deployment with Docker images. What happens when the Docker images are updated in the repository? Is the deployment affected from this update? I will answer that one and say no, they're not. They are completely decoupled. So a new version of the image is separate from a new version of the deployment, and you need to trigger the you need to tell Kubernetes that there is a new image to use, whether that's through updating the deployment or replica set or the cattail. The act of updating the Kubernetes or the Docker image does not update Kubernetes. There has to be a mechanism to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes the mechanism is automated, though.
Yes.
Some operators, for example, pull for new images. OpenShift does it automatically by default for anything where you have defined it as an image stream. I'm sure there's other stuff in cloud stuff, in addition to core Kubernetes, that automatically pulls for updated images, but that's not part of core Kubernetes itself.
Yeah, I
would.
Go ahead. I was just going to say.
You go.
Yeah, so I was just going to completely mirror what Josh said and say, like, from core Kubernetes standpoint, that they're decoupled, but there are lots of different solutions that do connect the container image lifecycle to updating the Kubernetes deployments.
Yeah, it makes sense. What I was going to add is like if you should really use a version for your image, and something that might slip is like if you use latest in the Kubernetes deployment and you just push a new image and update the latest tag. If a pod crashes or something, the new image might be pulled and you might have a weird mix. So you might want to be sure you're using fixed versions in your Kubernetes deployments to avoid these weird things.
Nick Dash says you could grab the new image unknowingly if the pod crash restarted. Right, this often comes back to avoid using latest. Then Omicronian chimes in saying that depends on your image pull policy as well. That I would agree with. Like if the pod is just restart, like if it successfully pulled the image, it will probably just continue to try using that image and not test if it can pull the image again. However, if it can't pull it, it will just continually try until it's there.
Yeah, but it's tricky because, well, that is the default policy, but it can change. Or maybe if the pod, like, let's say a node goes down and the pod is scheduled in another node where there was that never pulled that image, it will be pulled again. Yeah, so I wouldn't count on that to be like really sure about it.
All right. Next up, from Kubernetes users, we have Sweta. Hi all, is Grafana and Prometheus the right tool to set up monitoring and alerting on a Kubernetes cluster, like in AKS? If not, what is the best way to monitor an AKS cluster?
I don't know what AKS has in terms of like integrated monitoring, but I can at least say like majority of clusters where people are managing themselves, they are using Prometheus and Grafana in some way, shape, or form. Prometheus is sort of the default monitoring system used for a lot of folks.
Because it's awesome.
Yeah, I would add. Oh, sorry, Hugo.
No.
I would add that there are several tools to monitor some managed. You can just install a daemon set and it sends metrics to some hosted service. But yeah, Prometheus seems great.
All right. In office hours, if that's an L, Jay Laswell asks, we're moving from COPS to a managed Kubernetes solution. As part of this, we're working to standardize a lot of the CI pipeline and Kubernetes resource specs at the same time. Besides the recommended Kubernetes labels, are there other labels you all have found useful during your time managing Kubernetes, like app.company.io/internal equals true? And then they also linked to our docs that show common labels. Panel.
I don't have the shrug sticker. And the only thing that like we've done is like break down some of our stuff more into like the various different components of labeling something as a larger part of an application. Okay, yeah, they have a component in there. We don't use part of.
I've used part of before for when you have multiple pieces that get deployed all around for a large application.
And I know other some will do like the git commit hash or some of the other stuff in there. So that way, like when you're doing like an update or something like that, it gets added to your selector for services and things like that. I think it's very highly sort of business process specific.
Yeah, I would agree. Yoan DL also added that in Slack that Prometheus and Grafana are so easy to use and install, and it's complicated to use things like Asinga and other apps with Kubernetes. Nick commented that some labels or annotations, in this case, we use team for alerting, pipeline URL, which is what deployed it on GitLab, which environment it is, managed by, so whether it's managed by Ansible, GitLab, or Terraform. And then they use the recommended labels where possible, but these other labels seem useful. And the most useful one at the moment happens to be team and owner, especially with a larger scale Kubernetes cluster. That seems key.
I've also seen URL for some of our customers where they'll put a label as to what URL that services, so they know that a label is for like a specific domain name when you have multiple applications within a Kubernetes cluster.
Actually, I have a question for you. Do you see like most teams and groups like sharing namespaces? Because like for a lot of that stuff, I would like for specific teams, I would create their own namespace if possible and maybe label the namespace.
So it's usually a name. So it's either a namespace per team or a namespace per app. So we have folks that do both that we service. And so if you're doing a namespace per application, then what portion of the URL is serviced? So if it's say a login portion is this specific container in microservices, it's useful for a label of knowing that this specific container is servicing that URL.
I got you.
All right. If there's anyone listening and in the office hour Slack or Discuss that want to ask a final question, we're going to probably have time for 2 more. That being said, the next question, I got to scroll back down. From Kubernetes users, Cinder asks, I have a question regarding the cron job resource. In the spec, I've set both successful jobs history limit and failed jobs history limit to 3, and the backoff limit to 0. So basically, always keep history of minimum of the last 3 jobs and not retry immediately as they fail, even though the jobs are kept according to the history limits. According to the job docs, when a job completes, no more pods are created, but the pods are not deleted either. Keeping them around allows you to still view the logs of completed pods to check for errors, warnings, or other diagnostic output. The job object also remains after it is completed so that you can view its status. This seems to contradict the behavior I'm seeing with pods are deleted. Is this by any chance different for cron jobs, or is there a bug? For the record, they're using 1.11.7 on GKE. Now that I've read it out loud, I actually need to read it not out loud so I can digest it, unless someone else has an answer.
I was going to say, you're probably the best person to answer this question.
That's why I need to reread it. So they've set successful jobs history limit for cron jobs, successful jobs history limit, and failed jobs history limit. Okay, so when I wish I could like ask them their use case, but
I can add some more information. This was on Discuss, and I answered him, and he answered back. So maybe before you answer, he said on Discuss that he changed this settings from 3 to 1, another restart policy to never, and then the result was as expected. Like he could see the logs. And I asked him if the same was happening for successful board or only failed boards, and if change it back to 3, make it work again because magic. And he answered he's going to try, but so far with 1 it's working great, and he didn't try it with successful boards. He just had some bots that failed, and he couldn't see the logs.
That is bizarre that changing it to 1 worked and then changing, well, we'll see what happens when we change it back.
Yeah, that also sounds like a bug.
Yeah, because like, now that I've had time to think about it, so I was trying to remember the cron job like spec, and it's, the timing, and then there's a job spec, and then success, like, yeah, I guess we're gonna have to see what happens on Discuss and like what happens, because I've used successful and failed job history limit, and it's worked fine for me, but again, different environments. All right, I think this will be the last question unless someone else has asked anything. Oh, Omicronian has said, I had issues with job history using cron in the past. Now I set both settings for all jobs, successful and failed jobs history limits to 5. Omicronian, I would love to know what issues you had using job history with cron in the past, but I'm going to move on, and you can
Actually,
go ahead.
One quick thing on that is, I know that they are, like, the cron job controller is kind of jank. They are looking for someone to completely rewrite it. There is a role, like a Kubernetes role board post in Discuss, specifically looking for someone that might want to take ownership and improve that.
What I will add to that is, last I saw, they had gotten someone, but I don't know if that had panned out. Just fair warning. Bob, if you can track that one down, that would be good. Omicronian says, I think it was failed job history staying forever by default. All right, last question. Josh from Kubernetes Users asks, if I have 3 nodes with an Azure AKS master and the Nginx ingress installed by Helm with a static IP, what happens if one of the nodes goes down? Does the AKS master remap the static IP to 1 or more functioning nodes or something like that? Or is this not the best place to ask that? So ingress wouldn't be going through, well, I don't know how AKS is set up. I can't, does ingress go through the master on AKS? I can't imagine that would work. Like, that would be how it is.
I don't think so.
I thought it had a load balancer.
Like an Azure load balancer in front of it? That's what I would have thought as well. So I think the answer to this would be that if a node goes down, like there is an Azure load balancer in front of your nodes that is Kubernetes aware, and it would just route to one of the other 2 nodes.
Omicronian responded in chat.
All All right, Amakrani, you are definitely going to be on the panel next time. All right, I am glad that my understanding of cloud providers and Kubernetes is at least somewhat accurate. With that, it is 5 o'clock. We have gone over, so I am going to just say thanks to the following companies for supporting the community with their developer volunteers. Giant Swarm, StockX, Packet, Pusher.com, Red Hat, Samsung SDS, Weaveworks, VMware, Jing, Huawei, and the University of Michigan. Special thanks.
And Rada's company.
And Rada's company.
Rodrigo, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Which company again? Please, I need to write this down.
Kinvolk, but it's pronounced with an S because it's German.
Oh, awesome.
Kinvolk.io.
All right. Lastly, again, feel free to hang out and hashtag office hours afterwards. A lot of the channels can be super busy. The last thing I want to do is the quick raffle, which will be 1 through 3. And the winner of the raffle goes to Jay Laswell. Jay Laswell, you will receive a code to the CNCF store where you can get an awesome Kubernetes shirt. That's probably going to come from George, who sadly couldn't be here. With that, panel, thank you for being awesome. Viewers, thank you for being just as awesome. And everyone, have a wonderful day.